We're so glad that you've joined us today, and we have an exciting interview ahead with our wonderful friend, and many of you know her, Jill Weber. Jill, we want to welcome you. Yay!
Thank you. I'm sorry I missed the hair braiding memo. I would have been so into that. I could do it now. All right, I'll braid. We'll talk.
Actually, you got the hair for it. You look really good.
Does. She could pull it off.
Yeah, you really could.
There we go. I'll do one, and then I'll feel like part of the gang. How's that sound? All right, I'm in. I got a braid.
Oh, so we're really glad that you've joined us from across the pond.
Across the pond.
Yeah, and honestly, Jill, so for those, there's probably people who will be watching who don't know who you are. Could you just tell us and tell them a little bit about yourself?
I'm some random stranger that they just videoed out of the blue.
We thought, we need to do an interview for March, so we better find somebody.
No, my name's Jill Weber, Canadian, born in Vancouver, grew up all over Canada, started a house of prayer in the Southern Ontario area 2001 called the Greater Ontario House of Prayer, not to be confused with the Lesser Ontario House of Prayer. And it was going to be called the Golden Horseshoe House of Prayer, but then some pastors in local towns who weren't in the Golden Horseshoe were like, what about us? And they made sad puppy dog eyes, so we changed the name to Greater Ontario House of Prayer. And so I helped found and lead that house of prayer for 17 and a half years until I was relocated to the UK to help other houses of prayer across internationally. I now work with 24/7 Prayer, which is an international movement of prayer, mission, and justice. They help people pray, they create resources, but they also have a network of prayer communities. And so my job is to help support and undergird those prayer communities in various places.
That's awesome. I too now get to work for 24/7 Prayer Canada. I'm following in your
Resistance is futile. You will be assimilated.
Yeah, I'm beginning to feel like, shoot. Like,
yeah. We're just gonna pull her over.
She's trying.
Yeah.
And you've been trying for a while too.
Yeah.
She's trying.
Yeah. So, what is one of your favorite memories of leading prayer while you were in Canada? You said 17 years. Wow. That was a long time.
That's a lot of prayer meetings. I remember Mike Bickle saying once, I've logged more hours of unanointed prayer. So I don't think I've logged as many as Mike. But I think one of my favorite moments is we were having a Harpoon Bowl prayer meeting at a Center for At-Risk.
I'm going to stop you. What do you mean by Harpoon Bowl?
Oh, sorry. Okay. Do you know what my Scottish friend calls it?
What?
He calls it...
Uh-oh.
He calls it burp and howl.
Burp and howl.
Why is that?
Just because he's Scottish. Anyway, no. So Harpoon Bowl. So if you're a house of prayer that's not familiar with that particular lingo, that was a phrase that was adopted or made popular by the House of Prayer in Kansas City, where they were kind of looking at what prayer looked like in heaven. And they saw worship happening and music happening and bowls full of incense, which were the prayers of the saints. And they were like, okay, I guess if this is what's happening in heaven, then it should be happening on earth too. And how could we do that? So is that helpful, Aisha?
That is perfect. So you were saying you were in a Harpoon
It's like a
Bowl.
peanut butter sandwich. You take peanut butter and jelly. So you take worship and you take prayer and you kind of mash it all up together. And it's just tasty. I think the Lord likes it.
I think he loves it too.
So I was doing a Harpoon Bowl prayer meeting at this Center for At-Risk and Gang-Related Youth. And we had moved our house of prayer into probably one of the poorest neighborhoods in our city. And we were building community with our friends in that neighborhood, which at one point you pretty much had to be an ex-con to be one of our worship leaders. And we had this great Harpoon Bowl meeting. It was so good. There was about 8 of us in the circle. And there was one guy who was very proficient at air guitar. So he was like rocking it out on his air guitar, like leaning back and singing and praying, doing his air guitar. And then there was somebody else, one of our worship leaders, basically loved the 70s and sort of got stuck there. And she was amazing, a beautiful, beautiful intercessor. And she had a guitar and, socks and sandals, and just took us back to worship in the 70s. And it was lovely. And then we had another guy who had a brain injury, and he just kind of sat in his chair. And then all of a sudden he would sort of stand up and bellow out the words of the song. Because he has a brain injury, he got all the words wrong, but he had this beautiful singing voice. So he was just letting it rip. And then we had somebody else in the circle who was an elderly lady who was basically like snoring and sleeping, and then would kind of startle awake and pray for the Queen, and then fall back asleep. It was the best prayer meeting ever. I just utterly loved it. And you know what? The Lord loved it too.
Yeah.
Because we came as we were.
Yeah.
We brought what we had.
Yeah.
We offered it up. And it was beautiful. It was just beautiful. I will never forget that prayer meeting. I think that's my all-time favorite prayer meeting.
It sounds almost like a Monty Python episode.
I think it sounds like what heaven's going to look like.
Yeah, I think so. I think so too. That's awesome. So, in light of that and looking back, can you tell us some things that you feel that worked in leading a house of prayer? And as you're thinking about that, also think about, maybe you could tell us one or two things that you think maybe didn't work, or if you had the chance to do it again, you'd be like, no, I don't think I would ever do that again.
Yeah, because most directors of houses of prayer and people who are building, these are the stories that encourage us and help us to keep going. And
yeah. Sure, I got a couple startup stories. When I first started, the only model I had was IHOP Kansas City. And I'm thinking, global ministry, mega pastor, mega church, Mike. I ain't Mike. All right? It's just me, and nobody knows me, and I'm just this random, person, and no mega church, and not in the American Midwest. I could play guitar. I could sing. I had a Bible. And so I'm like, God, I don't even know how to do this. And two things the Lord said right away that I think carried me through the whole, well, it's still carrying me through now as we're helping establish houses of prayer across the UK and Europe. But number one, to build a house of prayer, you need to be a house of prayer.
There it is.
And that I cannot build something that is not already on the way to being built in my own life and heart. And so, and what I didn't realize was that God was far more invested in shaping me to become a house of prayer than I was invested in myself. And when you're like, oh God, make me a house of prayer, build me, you kind of think that God's a bit like Martha Stewart, that God will just sort of walk into your little house, that you want to be a house of prayer. And by you, I mean your own soul, your own life. And you think that God's going to be like Martha Stewart, and he's going to come plump up a couple of the pillows, maybe move a chair into the corner, buy you some nice table napkins. You don't realize he actually comes with a bulldozer, right? And it's Extreme Makeover Home Edition. And I think when we these are these dangerous prayers of God, come and take me, make my life a prayer and a song and an offering, was a song that I wrote at the beginning. I don't know what I was thinking. I was like, if I knew what that song was gonna, the journey that would put me on, I'd be like, stop it, don't do it, don't let that go. You know, the prayers where you pray like, God, here's my life. Oh, snooze, you lose, Lord. You got to be quicker than that. The dangerous prayers, you know? And so I went through at least 15 years of extreme home makeover bulldozer edition. And because he's not wallpapering our house, he's tearing it down to build a palace. You know, and so in order to lead a house of prayer, and actually even I think build is the wrong word. People ask me like, how do you build a house of prayer? And I say, you can't. Which they go like, what? You know, they get really depressed. They're like, oh no, what do I do? You know, but you can birth it. You can birth a house of prayer. Different than building. And so it births out of your own longing and desire and your own consecration to God and out of your own prayer life. That's where it comes. It's an inside out job. And so that's number one. Number two, the Lord said, you build it a person at a time. Because a house of prayer is not a building. The house of prayer is not a program or a platform. A house of prayer is a people, right? If we're going to look at this theologically correctly in light of the New Testament, we are being made into a house together of living stones. We are the tabernacle. We are the house of prayer individually, but more important, because the Hebraic mind wouldn't have thought necessarily of individualistic houses of prayer.
Right.
We together are a place of habitation of his presence, by his Spirit living in us.
Wow.
And so the Lord said, build it one person at a time. And you build it through relationships, friendships, co-conspirators. And you build it by praying together. I met recently, because we've just started another house of prayer. When I moved to the UK, I was working for 24/7, but also working for Pete Gregg's church. So Pete Gregg, who's the head internationally of the 24/7 prayer movement, and his very large local church, and so being put in charge of prayer in that church, I'm like, no pressure, you know. And but I really felt like a little house of prayer, sort of monastic, rattling around in a big old church, but we're in process now of establishing something called the Seed Community, which is a house of prayer. I'm actually in our prayer room right now. We're at Waverley Abbey, which is the ruins of a Cistercian monastery, where there's been prayer on this property for over 1,000 years, which is kind of exciting. But we know we can't build the house of prayer. We have to birth it. And I met with some proper monks. I met with a monk called Father Colin. He's a Benedictine. Has been a full-time, like Benedictine and a monastery Benedictine. He wears a habit and everything. And I interviewed him, went there on retreat, and I said, you know, how do you build a house of prayer? Which is, you know, they would call them monasteries. We would call them houses of prayer. And he says, well, you gather friends and you pray.
Wow.
That is beautiful.
And then what happens is whatever gift or grace that God has for you will come up out of your life together in God, in prayer. And so I think for me, we see a number of things in play. Is this all right? Is this too teaching?
It's totally good.
You know, it's for those who want to birth a house of prayer, you got to think about a few things: praying and making friends. That's, I think, just going to be on. I think that should be on my tombstone. She prayed and she made friends. That's basically all I do. And so, but it's God is going to draw together a group of people. There's going to be a gravitational pull. There's going to be a constellation of relationships that begin to orbit around each other. And there's going to be a little fire in your bellies of God. What can we, you know, how can we create a place together, Jesus, where you are loved?
Wow.
And then so he'll take that constellation of relationships. I call that the cast of characters. And then he'll plop them in a context. He'll put you somewhere. And so whether that's in Scarborough or whether that's in Oshawa or whether that's at Waverly Abbey. He'll put you somewhere, and there's something about where the place you're a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor. He's planted you somewhere because he had something in his heart for that little patch of land from the moment he created it. So context matters, place matters. And you got your cast of characters, you've got your context, and then you've got what monks call the charism. There's a unique gift or grace from heaven that you become to the people around you. You become the gift.
Wow.
And so what we discover is that many different houses of prayer will have a different charism. So IHOP Kansas City has a charism of worship, the fusion of worship and prayer, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's something on that. IHOP Kansas City has a charism around an end times message. So there's their particular assignments from heaven is maybe another way to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you can discern your cast of characters, your context, and your charism, if you can pray and make friends, then God can birth a house of prayer.
That's amazing.
So things that don't work. One thing that didn't work for us is we were like,
Sorry,
we're going to be just like
we're
IHOP.
just
And
over
we
here
spent-
in awe right now.
Yeah, we're still like going, oh my gosh.
We're just
like,
in awe.
that-
Yeah. Don't move on just yet. We're
That-
having a
Okay,
Salem
sorry.
moment.
was just like
We'll
one
pause
interview
and
right
let
there.
that sink
Yeah.
in.
That was so good. We just turned and looked at each other. You were still talking and we're like just looking at each other. Just yeah. So good.
Yeah, please continue.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's wonderful.
Yeah. So, now I've been derailed. You can't do that to a 50-year-old woman. We lose our train of thought,
You
and
were-
then the train
you
is
were
like
about to
scattered,
say, okay, what didn't
twisted
work?
metal all over the ground. Oh, things that don't work.
Yeah.
I think one thing that didn't work for us was we thought that we could somehow build a house of prayer if we had a really expensive sound system. And so we poured a lot of money into the gear on a big stage. And we actually discovered the big stage wasn't what God had called us to. He wasn't calling us to a platform. He was calling us to a circle.
Ooh, explain
Because
that
what
more.
happened with the stage was it created an us and a them. And it created a you pray, we watch.
Yes.
And it created a lot of dynamics that I was quite grateful when we moved away from that. Now, God may call some houses of prayer to do that, but he didn't call us to do that. That wasn't his invitation to us. So thinking that if we have the right building and the right equipment, all of that somehow is going to give us who we are. I always say start with the people, because prayer is portable, right?
Yeah.
And we did prayer every summer in the back of a U-Haul truck in a garbage alley in downtown
Yeah.
Hamilton,
I remember that.
right? Prayer, they still do it every summer, so that's secondary, right? So that was something. If I had to do over, what else would I do over? I remember early on, because I really wanted to do it right. I wanted to get everything organized. And I remember Kirk walking into my office one day in the first or the second year. And he said, "Jill, this is not the Greater Ontario House of Administration." Because at that point we were actually struggling. And I thought, well, if I just organize it enough, it'll happen.
Yes.
And so I realized that was not, that didn't help us necessarily. And that I was using I was avoiding prayer and the pursuit of God's presence by pursuing these other secondary things that made me feel more in control of the environment and the situation and like I could maybe build it.
Yeah. That
And
is
so-
so true.
Wow.
Yeah. I think the third thing that we discovered early on, we were not building the prayer movement in a locale. We thought we were, but we were actually discerning the prayer movement in a locale.
Can you
'Cause
unpack
God-
that?
Yeah, totally. God got there way before we did. Like the prayer movement, say in Hamilton, didn't start when GoHOP rocked up going, yeah, we're starting the prayer movement in the city, right? There have been decades and decades of faithfulness and faithful intercession in various ways and means and in various nooks and crannies of the city. And actually, the work was for us to discover where God was already at work in prayer in the city, where the pockets of faithfulness were, and then to see how we could then serve and support and catalyze and connect what was already happening in the city. And so I think that we at the onset, we lacked humility. We thought we were the thing. We were going to bring it, do it, right?
Yeah.
And we learned very quickly that that was not the way to see prayer flourish. And so actually I think the building language, you know what, Paul uses two types of language. He uses building language and he uses three: building language and birthing language and cultivation language. I lean heavily into the cultivation language. Jesus used cultivation language a lot in his descriptions of the kingdom. And so when I talk about prayer, I don't talk about building a prayer movement. I talk about cultivating prayer. And that cultivation, that nurturance, that, you know, that's got something to do with seasons. That's got something to do with dormancy. That's got something to do with hiddenness. That's got something to do with times when you are in the ground and it looks like nothing is happening at all except you're being split open and broken. And you think, oh my gosh, this is the end of me. But in actuality, it's the beginning of everything.
Wow.
And so that's why the cultivation language for me is so potent and powerful. And that's why I lean into it. And that's why we're calling ourselves the seed community, unless the seed falls into the ground. Because we're small. And most houses of prayer are hidden.
Yes.
They're small and they're hidden. But they proliferate. We can cover the earth. Weedy and seedy. That's us.
Love that.
So,
Wow. I was going to ask you, Jill, like, you know, what would you say to, you know, encourage House of Prayer leaders and directors? But I feel like everything she just said.
It did that, but if there was something specific that...
if there was something specific.
Yeah.
Yes. I think I learned something really important in COVID. And in this last year, one of the first things we did when lockdown hit was we discovered the gift of Zoom. And so we created the upper Zoom and we created virtual prayer Zooms. And actually, even though I had all kinds of prayer rhythms and structure, this is the first time in my life where I actually have a proper monastic rhythm of multiple prayer points in the day that I don't have to carry myself. I've got a community that holds those spaces with me. And now in this technology, there's no barriers to this now. We can do this. This is the gift of this season to us. We've learned, right, to remove the barriers.
Yeah.
And last week I couldn't do the calls because I had some health issues. And honestly, by the end of the week, I felt like I was a fish flapping in the bottom of a boat. I was just like, oh. Throw me back in the water, you know. And I realized again, you know, I'm 20 years in. I've been a prayer missionary. 20 years in, my natural habitat is his presence, held in a community of people. And I've really come to understand how important being held in that community of us being in his presence together is. Because to be honest, you're not going to feel like praying every day.
Yes.
Right?
That's
Unless
the
you're way
truth.
more spiritual than I am. How many
That's the
times
truth.
have I dragged my sorry butt to the prayer meeting going, ugh. You know, and you get there and you're like, bless the Lord, oh my soul. You know, and you just try to sneak a look at your phone.
Yes. Yes.
So true.
Really, it's my Bible app, honestly, as I
Yeah.
scroll through it, you know? And
Candy Crush.
and how much I'm held by the prayer community. Because I think one of the ways, and particularly as leaders, I think one of the disservices that we do ourselves is we think we got to carry it. We think we got to hold it. We think we have to energize it. We don't, and we can't.
Yeah.
But if we can just faithfully show up, get your butt in the chair, in the presence of the company of the faithful, whether that's an upper Zoom or in a prayer room, then God meets us, whether we feel it or not. Right? Best song of the year. Well, it didn't come out this year, but was popularized this year. Even though I can't feel it, you're working. Right?
Yeah.
Even though I can't see it, you're working.
Yeah.
And to realize, and I love this. This is one of the things that I heard down in IHOP, Kansas City, was Kirk Bennett, other ones saying, it feels like a curtain of fatigue and boredom, but there's a man on the other side of the curtain.
Oh, gee.
Right?
Wow.
There's a man on the other side of the curtain. And so we might not break through into an awareness of God's presence, but he's there. Anyway, so those are some things for me. Very aware as a house of prayer leader, I am giving God permission to ruin my life. Right?
Yeah.
This is not a, if you're putting yourself up on the altar to see a house built, it's an altar, right? It's an altar of sacrifice. And it is, for me, has been and continues to be. It's not just, the initial pioneering was costly. It continues to be extremely costly.
Wow.
But why should I offer up to the Lord that which costs me nothing?
Mm-hmm.
And so if we think that this is just a fun little hobby I'll have as a sidebar, and maybe somebody will notice me and my Spotify list will go up or whatever, we'll see if you're still here 5 years from now.
Yeah.
But are you, I was reading a book by a nun. I actually learned after studying books on prayer after about the first 7 years, I realized all the best books are at least 100 years old. So you got to read old books by dead people if you want to grow in
I
prayer.
agree too. That is true.
And there was one nun who was just saying, can you stand in his presence and give him permission to do anything he wants to do with you?
Wow.
And there's a breath prayer that I'm often not courageous enough to pray, but how's this one? Holy Spirit, come and possess me utterly.
Wow. Can you explain what a breath prayer is?
Yeah, sure, a breath prayer. Well, we do them all the time. IHOP people do them all the time. You guys call them we call them a chorus.
Yeah.
You just
Well done. That is so true. You just
know,
took
I
all
was
the
talking-
mystery
I was
and the
talking
weird
with-
out
with-
of it. That was wonderful.
Yeah, because what happens, I think the genius of Mike Bickle is that Mike Bickle has taken historic monasticism and he has reinterpreted it for his generation.
Yeah.
Right? IHOP's a monastery.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
So that's part of his genius. And so essentially a breath prayer is just a little fragment of a prayer that you just, as often as you breathe, you just, and so it'll happen to you. Oftentimes, I know that the Holy Spirit lives in me, and the Holy Spirit is always adoring and worshiping the Father, because I wake up every morning with a song bubbling, floating around inside of me, and I'm like, woohoo! The Holy Spirit was like doing his thing while I was sleeping.
Yeah.
Loving the Father, loving Jesus. And I get to listen and I wake up in the morning and it's there, in this little snippet of something.
Yes.
And or oftentimes when we're praying or we're worshiping, there'll be a word or a phrase. My favorite right now, you see me, you know me, you love me through and through, right?
Mm-hmm.
Damn you, Will Reagan, for writing that first, What happens, though, is that little phrase It's like an earworm. I call them earworms.
Yes.
They wiggle their way in,
Yes.
and they just zoom around inside of you all day. And then you
Yeah.
realize, wow, I've actually been aware of the presence of God quite a bit today.
Yeah.
Wow. Yes.
Because I don't know how, I'm just walking down the street going, and I'm like, oh, I'm totally praying. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
You know,
Absolutely. It's like
so,
a
because
little
I'm
musical
actually
hook.
not content. I am not, people are like, okay, we'll just do a prayer room. We'll get people to sign up for a 1 hour prayer a week or 1 hour prayer a day. And I'm like, where's your ambition? Where's your ambition? No. Paul said, pray without ceasing.
Yes.
Can we raise up a generation who are alive and responsive to the presence of God, whether they're in their prayer room or whether they're in the bathroom or if they're on the train going to London?
Oh
Wow.
my gosh, so good. And in it, I just want to tag onto that. Can we raise up a generation? Like, how do we do that? The next generation of those who will be involved in the prayer movement or houses of prayer, or, to me, they're all the same thing. Do you have some advice on how to reach the next generation?
I love them. First of all, you have to live a life worth imitating. Number one. You got to live a life worth imitating. So if I'm living a middle class, middle age, safe, cushy life, why would anybody be interested in, like, what's, Lord, if your presence goes with me, how will they distinguish us from any other people on the earth? Right?
Yes.
Moses understood that.
Yeah.
He was past middle age. He got that. And so can we as leaders carry glory? Can we change the spiritual atmosphere of a room? Like, I don't care about the size of my Twitter feed, but I care about what happens when, like, does that make sense?
Yes.
I'm just trying to, it's not about plan and production and structure and strategy. That's not, it's about, am I a holy habitation? Am I a holy habitation, first and foremost? And if I'm a holy habitation, is there something about my life that is attractive? Can people see Jesus? And then you ask. So the only way to build prayer, you got to ask. Like, God, you guys know my story where I was kind of working on GoHOP, the House of Prayer, and I went through this really low season of deconstruction. God will take us as leaders periodically through these seasons of deconstruction and then reconstruction us. So he will dismantle us to remantle us.
Right.
So I had been dismantled. And the Lord said to me, Jill, I want you to raise up the next generation of champions. And I'm like, not going to happen. I am not cool. I call a prayer meeting and I get 5 50-year-old ladies with flags and shofars, And they're awesome. God loves
She went there.
50-year-old ladies with flags and shofars. Like, he loves them and he hears their prayers. But I don't have a nose ring, Lord. I'm not cool enough. And I wrestled with the Lord and realized that, actually, you know what, Jill? It's not about you. And I just said yes. So you say yes to his invitation. You say yes to his purpose. And then I looked around going, are there any young people around me? I don't know any. There's Aisha. You were young back then, Aisha.
I was.
And Justin. You were like the only younger people I knew. I thought, well, can I love them well?
Yeah.
Because so you build a house of prayer person at a time. Find a next generation leader or not a leader yet and love them well.
Yeah.
So that's all I know how to do. I don't know. There may be people who are way better at it than I am.
No.
But
and to attest to those early days, it was like myself, Zion. I think our team was so small. Maybe there was like 5 of us. who said yes to this lifestyle. And I remember this moment stuck out to me so much. I talk to people about this all the time now, but I remember in those early days when Zion and I had just started meeting in the morning, we said, we're in our I was in my early 20s and Zion's like mid 20s. And we're like, we're going to pray. And we're going to pray at 6 a.m. I don't know why we chose 6 a.m., but we did. And that was the Lord, because it's still the grace.
Early bird gets the anointing. That's my theory. Always. Early bird gets the
Maybe.
anointing.
Maybe. If you want worms, then you can get up there early, is what I say.
But I remember this. I don't know if you remember this, Jill, but in those days, like Zion and I are like trying to wake up early in the morning and jump on the bus to get to the prayer room. And I remember one morning we both slept in, and it's like still dark out, and we're like racing to the little church on Bayview, to go and pray. And we turn the corner and we just see like headlights. And Jill, who was like 2 hours away from us, got there before we did. She was there at 6 a.m. It was still dark. It must have been like maybe sometime in the winter or like late fall or something. It was still dark. And she showed up on time for our prayer meeting just to stand with us. Two young girls who decided we wanted to be a house of prayer and say yes to this lifestyle. And I don't even know what time you would have had to have gotten up in the morning to get a car and drive.
Just my normal time.
Yeah, that's very true, actually. Yeah,
it is.
Yeah, she's an early bird.
Yeah.
And, just to show up, come to a whole other city to pray with two young women who didn't really know what we were doing, but we had this longing in our hearts from the Lord, and you stood with us. And as the years went on, you were this faithful, like we called Jill Mama Bear, because she just, helped us in our journey and would meet with our team. And I remember you and Kirk, and sometimes you'd bring some of the team, like Denny Roy, and I remember Abraham. Yeah. And you would come and we would just eat together. And I think what you said is so profound. It doesn't seem like it's a big deal, but just to love on the next generation and make space for them is so key and so important, because it's this thing of like, on one side, it's recognition, like when an older generation says to you, I see you and I value you, it does something in the heart of the next generation to say, hey, I have a place at this table. And we're so thankful to you. Like, it's interesting. I know this is an interview, but I have to say this. Like, I'm sitting here thinking, has she gotten more fiery over the years? Like,
I think so.
What is? Yeah, you feel that, right?
Yep.
It's like you are just going from glory to, like, I've heard you teach on prayer and houses of prayer. Like, I've gotten to come with you to, like, when you've taught.
All of my boring stories.
Yeah.
You're like, oh no, she's telling that one again.
And I'm sitting here like, oh my gosh, like, who is this woman? Like, I've never met you before. Like, you have been going from glory to glory to glory. And it is such an honor for us to, like, Lorna and I just keep looking at each other. Like, it is such an honor to have you, and even for the Canadian houses of prayer and the prayer movement that's being cultivated here, like, you have planted so many seeds that, we see the fruit of it today.
Yeah.
And I actually got an email the other day from a couple who want to do prayer in the city, and they said your name in the email. They don't even know that I know you. They're like, we remember years ago, Jill Weber did, 12 days or 10 days of 20. We want to do something like her.
House of the King?
Yeah.
House of the King.
And this is a couple, like, they've been in China serving as missionaries for the last 15 years and have come back to the city.
Wow.
And they put you in the email of like, can you help us do what Jill did years ago? And you see that you're not here, like, in terms of physically in the nation anymore, but the seeds that you have planted, over a decade ago are, as you said, it's split, it's started to germinate, and it's risen to the surface. And we are so thankful to you and all that you have poured into this nation, into us personally. Thank you.
You guys are so lovable. So you're like ETLs, easy to love.
I got to ask you another question, Jill. So you are, of course, you're now in the UK. Do you see the prayer movement differently being in a different country, looking at Canada now?
Like, do I see the Canadian prayer movement differently?
Yes. From an international perspective, really.
From an international perspective. That's a good question. I'm not sure that I see people. I think when I think about the prayer movement, I don't think about like a cloud floating over the country. Or organization names even. I think people. I think people. And I actually think this isn't a thus saith the Lord. This is a thus wondereth Jill. But it's been bubbling away, hasn't it?
Yes.
For a long, long time. And I think the house, when we started GoHOP 2001, there were 2 houses of prayer in our stream, in our movement, before us. And so 20 years ago, there was 1 or 2, 3. And when I left, there were at least 35, if not more. And they're just kind of, bubbling up, and so I think the work in Canada is not again, it's the same as in the city. Your work is not going to be to build the prayer movement in Canada. It's to discern. Because Jesus says, I build my church. Yeah. Right? Jesus is building it. And there's been so much seed that's gone out through the 24/7 prayer movement, through the Lectio 365, a funny little daily devotional app that we did, basically teaching people how to pray scripture. It's on 200,000 phones right now. Wow. It's ridiculous. Not even a year old. And it's just like, and all these people learning how to pray the word. So fun. Where that hasn't been their tradition. Yeah. And so there's those seeds going out. There's all the seeds of all the IHOP, so that webcast prayer room going out and broadcasting across all the nations, raining down seed across, all of that stuff landing in the ground, and then just networks of friendships and relationships. So it's interesting. It feels like I'm very curious to watch the landscape over the next 10 years. To see what emerges. But I think the job for those of you there are watching and praying and making friends, watching and waiting, because it's emerging, it's coming up out of the ground. And can you perceive it? And so, you're going to have so many more new friends 10 years from now. Yeah. And it'll be astounding how beautiful and diverse and unusual. And maybe the House of Prayer movement will be more like my crazy little prayer meeting with the air guitar and the prayers for the Queen and in terms of its curiosity and diversity. I was once asked, what does the prayer movement look like? And it was just after I had visited Versailles. My mom, God bless her, for my 40th birthday, took my daughter and myself to Paris. Oh, wow. So, and we went to Versailles, outside of Paris. Beautiful manicured gardens. Everything had a place. It was all in a row. Everything was like neatly, even the goldfish, somebody brushed their hair. Everything was lined up and beautiful. But I don't think the House of Prayer is like that. I don't think you're going to line them up in rows and squadrons and all of that. I think the prayer movement in Canada and globally is an English garden, which is wild chaos, this direction, that direction, just kind of, beautiful in its diversity and creativity. Yeah. Anyway, so I think if you try and create a French garden, you're going to miss it.
Mm-hmm.
But if you appreciate and discern the English garden, then maybe you'll find a little bit of Eden there. We'll see. We'll see. So,
Mm-hmm.
You've been in the House of Prayer movement for a long, long time. You're also a mother. What are some tips that you would give to families that are in houses of prayer, wanting to, venture into this monastic lifestyle? What are some tips you can give families?
yeah, we've got, with our House of Prayer that we're developing here at Waverly, we're building it virtually right now. Of course, in COVID, we can't do actually a lot in person. So we're building all of our prayer rhythms, and our community formation stuff is all happening online. And there's this family that just swung into our orbit. They have 3 kids, and they just started showing up in all the prayer meetings, and so we're like, okay, these guys, they've got the bug. Like, we have to just invite them into a closer orbit of what we're doing. And so, and we call ourselves the Seed Community. So the children, we offered the kids some options. It was the sprouts, the seedlings, and anyway, they took a vote. They decided they wanted to be called the seedlings. And they actually lead us in prayer once a month. So they are, I'm going to get the ages wrong. Sorry in advance, guys. 9, 7, and 4. And the 9-year-old can actually do proper worship songs on a guitar. And so his dad tapes him ahead of time because it's a little bit too scary to do it live. But then shows us the videos and like Matt Redman songs. He's just just going for it. And the 4-year-old is telling us Bible stories that she's memorized. And then we all did some coloring.
That is awesome.
And they let us. They let us.
Wow.
And they did it once, and I'm like, oh, you're totally doing that regularly. You are not an addendum. You are not a distraction. You are a full-on contributing member of this community. So lead us. And then it helps to have inside jokes. And so for families, creating fun, food, a little bit of frivolity. So one of our running jokes, because we got 120 acres here at Waverly Abbey, we decided that we want to have llamas. Oh, alpacas because they're nicer than llamas. And so we're like, so it'd be really fun to have alpacas. And so just as a joke, I sent them some like plastic alpacas through Amazon, and so that the kids could have their very own alpacas. And then they're sending us all these Photoshop images of these alpacas in like strange places. So, what God says, God promises joy in the house of prayer.
Yes.
That's
right.
Yes.
I'll bring them to my holy mountain. I'll give them joy in the house of prayer. The ones that those that we thought maybe didn't have a place in the house.
Yeah.
He pulls all the ones from the edges into the center and says, you are going to have joy in the house of prayer. And actually, so I think house of prayer people should, there's an invitation from the Lord to be the most joyful people on the planet. I love watching Mike Bickle in the prayer room. Back before they gave him his own private office, he was hilarious. He'd hide under a table, right? And in the prayer room, I don't know if you guys were back in the day, he would hide under one of the tables in the prayer room. This was back when it was in the trailer, not in the main building now. And then every once in a while, he would pop up like a prairie dog, with this big goofy grin on his face. And he would just look over the room with this like big cheesy grin. And then he'd go, pop down again back in his little prairie dog hole under the table. So much joy.
Yes.
So much joy.
Yeah.
And so kids will help us with that.
Yes.
Joy to the house. And for us, just so you're aware, we've got 2 hearts of our prayer community. So the prayer room is one heart, the table is the other.
Right. Yes.
And so we'll feast on his presence, and then we'll feast.
I love that.
And both are utterly vital. And so we're actually a family together, creating a space where Jesus is loved.
That's beautiful.
And so just that means that we got to make space for the kids, and we have to change our modality. Like, we've got a prayer room. The prayer room I'm sitting in right now has all these little interactive prayer spaces, one of which looks like a sandbox. So there's something for kids to do when they come in to pray. We've got a tent. You can actually come in and sit in the tent, and the kids come and sit in the tent. So we've actually created a prayer room that's kid-friendly.
Wow.
And interactive, and a prayer classroom so that children can learn how to pray. And part of 24/7 prayer, one of the things I love about that movement, what they bring is they've really done a lot of work in prayer spaces in schools. It's one of their websites.
Yeah.
Prayer spaces at home over COVID, just creating. And now Lectio 365, we're beginning to develop Lectio 365 for families. And so we've actually created ways of being together in God's presence as a family. So models and modes that are for all of us to do together.
Wow.
That's so good.
So
Yeah,
that would be.
I've played Lectio for my sons. I think it was you, actually. You were speaking, I can't remember on what, or maybe it was on Martin Luther King, and I think you were the voice that night, and we played it at night for the kids. Yeah, it's very, even as it is actually very kid-friendly, because they can hear the word being read to them, and so good. That was really good.
Yeah, well, the kid-friendly one is going to be like kids reading the scriptures, and like, it's just, we're really excited about it. So it'll come sometime in the fall. It'll launch. No, I did write one book, and I will talk about that briefly, because I actually think it's helpful for houses of prayer. I wrote a book called Even the Sparrow, and a Pilgrim's Guide. What is it? Prayer, trust, and following the leader. Because the only thing I know about leadership after 25 years of ministry is that I actually just have to follow, listen, and be responsive to God's invitation. So, so that's been that's basically the story of how I was built into and then helped build a house of prayer. And then the next book is I think, it's still a work in progress. It's called Monastery. And it's a pilgrim's guide to bearing, birthing, and I'm not sure the third thing yet. And so it's an exploration of, what is it an exploration of? That's a good question. It's an exploration of motherhood. It's an exploration of spiritual mothering. It's an exploration of how we, I don't even want to use the word intercessors, because then if I use the word intercessors, then some people will think this is only for some people and not for other people.
Right.
But for how we as apprentices of Jesus can receive his dreams and his invitations and the things that he wants to birth inside of us, how we can then carry those things to term and bring them forth into the world.
Release revelation, release